Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. Hope you had some lunch break. And now it's the time for David and Nikolai's talk. Their talk is about pedology. Yeah, in Vygotsky's pedagogical work, Volume 2, The Problem of Age. And we'll give time to David and Nikolai.
In that order. So I'll go first and then Nikolai will tell you something about the book itself. I think what I want to say first is to try to make sense of what we've all heard this morning. I'm not trying to preempt your own feedback sessions, your own synthesis sessions. I'm just trying to take part in them. So the way I felt about the morning sessions was Eugene Matusov presents a kind of thesis and Jos presents kind of an antithesis. I was joking with her that she had a long road to hoe because she had to undo some of what Eugene was presenting. So Eugene presents the idea that education is not about learning, which is kind of a shocker, actually. But Eugene presents the idea that education is about, I don't know, self-examination and self-discovery. And that's the purpose of education. And Jos is having none of that. Jos is basically saying that education is a way of life, a way of labor, a form of work, both for the teacher and for the child, but not simply self-discovery, not simply self-examination, definitely learning. And what Nikolai and I are going to try to do is to synthesize these views for you, to show you that in addition to Bakhtinianism, sort of deconstruction, and in addition to cultural historical activity theory, there is a third way. There is another way of understanding Vygotsky and of understanding your own PhD work, particularly if you're working with children, and particularly if you're working with learning and development. And that way is called pedology. That is what this whole series of books is about. It's about the kind of writing that took up more than a third of Vygotsky's total output. And certainly it was what was on his pay stub. It was what he was hired to do. It's the holistic discovery of the child in the course of learning and development. And if you're working with children, you'll find this an interesting book. Nikolai's going to tell you more about it. Nikolai?
Sorry, I was making some notes during David's speech. Well, thank you for coming. I see some participants interested in this presentation. Well, I just want to, before we begin to discuss the content, I just want to tell you a little bit about the whole project of the translation of Vygotsky's pedagogical works. As you can see here, this is volume 2, which means that it definitely should be volume 1. But yeah, and there is volume 1. If you go to Springer's website, you will find volume 1 of pedagogical works, which is Lectures on Pedology or Foundations of Pedology. And this is the second volume, which was just recently published by Springer. And what we are doing with David is we are translating the pedology of adolescent in 2 volumes. So totally it will be translation of Vygotsky's pedagogical works in 4 volumes. So and the amount of volumes and the content is now comparable to the 6 volumes of the collected works. And the only problem is that there was a group of people, about 20 people, working with the translation of 6 volumes for plenum, but there are only 2 of us who did the translation of 4 volumes of Vygotsky's pedagogical work. And well, in doing this project, in doing this translation, we just wanted to meet the 2 challenges, to address 2 challenges. And these 2 challenges are, challenge number 1, Vygotsky's pedagogical works were unknown for Western audience. These are the first actually the first systematic translation of Vygotsky's pedagogical works in English. But you might be surprised, but these pedagogical works of Vygotsky were unknown for Russian researchers for many years. So first several chapters, or 4 chapters of this book, were translated in collected works in 80s, in Russian collected works, and then reproduced in Plenum's collected works in 90s. And the second part of this book was available from 2001 from Korotayeva's lectures on pedology. So what I'm saying is that these pedagogical works of Vygotsky became available to Russian researchers in 80s, from 80s, not before, okay? But now we are making them available for English-speaking academics. And I think it's very important. That was the first challenge. And we were very proud to make this translation and introduce this translation to the international audience. And the second challenge was problem with the translation. You know that the quality, if you look at the translations of Vygotsky in English translations, you see that the problem is that there are a lot of mistakes. So translations are very far from perfection. Even if you take collected works, 6 volumes, for English readers, it might look perfect. But for example, for me and for those who read Russian, we see a lot of mistakes in translation. And I can tell you honestly that many of Vygotsky's ideas, including even the general genetic law of development, were not translated correctly. And this generates a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of misreadings, a lot of misinterpretations, and sometimes even the situation when Russian researchers and English-speaking researchers do not understand each other because they are working with different sources. Russians are working with Russian sources, and English-speaking researchers are using English translations. And from my experience, I saw several times that the people were discussing things that they didn't understand each other. So that was the challenge. David and myself, we wanted these 2 volumes or these 4 volumes of Vygotsky's pedagogical works to be translated as much as good as possible. And it was a fantastic combination of 2 of us. David, linguist. David is an expert in Vygotsky and linguist. David feels English, well, I know, like it's a blood of him. So my English is far from perfection, but as you can imagine, I fluently speak Russian. So, and that's why when we did the translation, sometimes we were discussing days and hours about to find the best translation of one sentence or one paragraph. Sometimes there were debates and bloody fights between 2 of us, what might be the best way to translate. So that's why the process goes very slowly. But from my point of view, this is a very good translation. So we try to meet this challenge. And why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because I want to publicly express my gratitude to David about this, because David was a motor, David was the initiator, and David did the most of translation about it. My participation, my participation was just 10%. 90% participation was David, because it was his idea and it was his hard work in translating and writing the notes and commentaries. And thank you, David, for that. And I was very happy you invited me to work with you, and I really enjoyed us working together. So now I think we can come to the point. We can come to the book. David, please. Now your turn.
Thank you, Nikolai. Nikolai is very kind. But one of the points that Vygotsky makes is that the steps that the child takes in growing up are not equal in size. And in particular, when you're translating a book, the first step is the biggest. And the first step when you're translating a Russian text is the step that's taken by a Russian native speaker who understands the text perfectly. And that was Nikolai's contribution. I think if you're doing qualitative research, you understand that the 80%, 20% division of labor that Nikolai just outlined for us is probably, take it with a block of salt, take it with a mine of salt, take it as a purely quantitative measure of something that's quite qualitative. Let me start with something that's, you would think, completely quantitative, namely, how old is the child when Ishak is studying her teaching of English to her teaching of academic literacy to learners? This is one of the first questions you got to ask. Even when you look at Davidov's work, I think Nikolai Davidov was one of your professors. I know he was one of
yes.
And Davidov was certainly one of Vygotsky's students, and part of that.
Not direct student.
Not direct.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that Davidov puts before us is, how does the child learn what a number is? Some people in the United States have pointed out that Russians are better at mathematics than Americans. And one of the reasons might have something to do with the fact that numbers in the Soviet system were introduced in a very different way from the way they're introduced in the United States. We're taught to count apples or oranges or something like that. Whereas Russians are very often taught to measure. And, measure, I don't know, banana milk in a big tank using bowls and cups and stuff like that. How do you take a whole and you break it down into parts that are aliquot and fungible? By aliquot, I mean units that will fit perfectly into a larger unit. And by fungible, I mean that the units are interreplaceable, like money or weight or time. A minute is a minute is a minute. And Russians are taught to do this quite early, and it makes learning fractions, not just learning fractions, but learning algebra, makes it a lot easier. And so my dad, who went to study in the Soviet Union in the 1960s as a physicist, noticed that the Russians didn't do computers back then. They did pencil and paper, and they were good, really good. They had a system of numbers that worked extremely well. So let's take a page out of their book. When you ask a child, how old are you? You're asking a question that to the child is really a qualitative question, but you're asking it in a very quantitative way. How many times has the earth gone around the sun since you were born? This is obviously not how the child understands it, but when you think about it, that's what the question means in English. Or does it? Because in fact, you want to know something that's much more interesting and difficult to answer than the numerical or calendrical or astronomical answer. You want to know, how does this child compare on the basis of the child's stature, the height, on the basis of the child's weight, on the basis of the child's behavior, on the basis of the child's speech, on the basis of the child's thinking, or what we can glean of that thinking from what the child says. How does this child compare with typical children of that age cohort? So that, in a nutshell, is Vygotsky's starting point. And in chapter 2, he gives us 3 ways of answering that question, and they're all wrong, all of them. The first one is metaphorical, i.e. analogy. You compare child development to something that isn't child development. Child development is a calendar. It's marks on the kitchen wall when the child grows. Or child development is like a plant growing. This is what Froebel, Pestalozzi, it's what people meant when they created kindergartens, gardens of children for them to grow in. Or child development is something like animal taming, taming a wild horse. This is where we get expressions like free-range parenting or child wrangling, like a circus, or to get into modern pedology. Modern pedology does not start with Vygotsky. It starts with people like Hall, G.S. Hall, and they believed that in some weird way, as Haeckel would say, ontogeny, child development, recapitulates phylogeny, i.e. biological evolution. So we undergo a sort of a plant period and then an animal period, and then an ape period and then a human period. Or some other people, particularly Germans, like Huskensiller, for example, believed that child development is something like historical development, that we start in a kind of a primitive period, and then there's a Middle Ages, which is the teenage period, and then finally full adulthood. All of these, including the comparison of childhood to kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, and high school, all of these are comparing child development to something that is not child development. So I'm going to call those metaphors because they're all analogies in some way. And they're wrong. They're wrong, according to Vygotsky. Although they're not equally wrong, because Vygotsky says a great deal of what teachers know has been developed historically. And so there is some grain of truth, large or small, in our division of children into preschool, school age, and middle school, and so on. The second category is metonyms. Metonyms are what in English are called synecdoches. A synecdoche is when you take the part as being equivalent to the whole. So for example, if I say the shirt on your back, but I don't mean your shirt, I mean all your clothes. Or if I say the roof over your head, but I don't mean the roof over your head, I mean your housing. Or for example, wheels instead of a car, or the White House instead of the American government. All of these are synecdoches, they're all metonyms. And actually school age is a metonym, because when you say school age, you're referring to only one part of the child's overall experience, and you're taking that as a kind of a stand-in, almost a metaphor for the whole. And there were a couple of these around in Vygotsky's time. He has good fun discussing them. His colleague down the hall, a wonderful guy by the name of Pavel Blonsky, talks about child development as a process of tooth replacement. And there's a kind of fake Marxist theory behind this, where he says that the teeth are the child's tools of production, and that the reason why children have a period of play in preschool is that they start to eat meat with their teeth, and they have so much energy that you have to have them running around so that they can burn up all their energy, and so on. That sounds funny to us today, simply because we're not used to thinking in such, thinking of teeth as tools of production. But when you think about the Freudian way of looking at children, like Melanie Klein, for example, who wrote Psychoanalysis for Children, what you get is kind of child development is a process of sexual awakening. In other words, doing the opposite of what Blonsky did. Blonsky sort of takes tooth replacement and projects it onto the whole of childhood. And Melanie Klein, who Luria was very fond of for some reason. Vygotsky just doesn't like her very much. Melanie Klein is sort of doing the opposite, taking sexual maturation at the end of childhood and kind of projecting it backwards so that you get periods of infant sexuality and preschool sexuality and so on. And in each case, you've got a metonym. You've got a part taken to be the whole. And also, whenever we say first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, although it sounds aliquot and fungible, it sounds like you're measuring weight or height or something like that, you're basically taking a certain aspect of the child's life, namely school learning, and taking that as a stand-in for the whole. So all of those are going to be metonyms, and metonym is really a kind of a partial solution. And then finally, mixes. These are my names, not Vygotsky's names, but Vygotsky talks about eclecticism, and that's exactly what this is. You've got a sort of a changeable basket of different developmental traits. So you might think okay, Blonsky is sort of right and Melanie Klein is sort of right. Let's put them together like oil and vinegar. Like you can make a vinaigrette. Actually, Nikolai tells me that a vinaigrette is actually a kind of salad and it's not a salad dressing. but you could take these very different things like oil and vinegar and shake them together and produce a kind of emulsion for describing child development. So when we look at toddlers, we look at their teeth. When we look at teenagers, we look at their sex organs and how much hair they've got under their armpits and whether they sweat and smell after PE class and so on. And so in this eclectic point of view, this sort of mixed point of view, child development is one damn thing after another, sort of teething for toddlers and sexual differentiation for teenagers. And we have one set of measurements in preschool and we switch to a completely different method in high school. None of these, not one, is really a measurement of development itself. All of these, every one, are subjective. And I mean in a bad way, not in a good way. We're choosing something that's easy to observe, easy to measure, rather than something that is of the essence, fundamental, substantial, significant. It's like you lose your keys in the bedroom and you go look for them in the kitchen because the light is better. You're just looking at things that are easy to observe and not the things that really matter. So what do? We're trying to measure something that is not even observable, namely mental development, the emergence, if I can use that term that Joseph was making fun of higher mental functions in children. Well, here's an idea. We measure development with development itself, as if we are folding development back on itself and using development to measure development. And John will know right away what I mean when I say we look at acceleration instead of looking at velocity. Acceleration, velocity squared, the velocity of velocity. We look at the development of development. We look at units of child development that are defined by how fast is development taking place. That is Vygotsky's great insight. Now, Vygotsky wasn't the first one to come up with this idea. As usual, Americans have kind of a knack of being first with the wrong answer. And Minot and Gazelle came up with this rather bizarre graph where the vertical lines on the graph in front of you are simply measurements of how long it takes for the child to add 10% of its weight, of its body weight. That's the top chart. And the bottom chart, which Giselle doesn't really explain very well, is how long it takes the child to add on 10% of mental growth. Now, you might imagine immediately you're asking, how does he know that? Huh? And you may notice that the lines for physical growth seem to match the lines for mental growth rather suspiciously closely. And you are right to be suspicious. On the one hand, Minot has a firm grasp of the obvious. And on the other hand, Gazelle has a very fanciful grasp of the tenuous. He claims that basically mental and physical growth are just two sides of the same coin. It doesn't seem to be, well, there's a problem before we can say that. Weight units are aliquot. That is to say they can be subdivided with no remainder. Weight units are fungible. A pound is a pound is a pound. Units are all the same, they're replaceable with each other. So just like if you're dealing with money, 100 cents to $1, or a pound is 2 half pounds, 4 quarter pounds, and a pound is always a pound. But is that true of Gazelle's tests? Well, Gazelle used his tests from Binet, Alfred Binet. And Binet, who later gave us our IQ tests, it wasn't quite that simple. Binet had to work with a guy, with another, Simon, and then they put together tests that were not designed to measure G or intelligence or anything like that. They were basically designed to help the teacher figure out where are the problem kids, who are the kids who need extra help. And it consists of a bunch of different tasks, like For example, you're late for class. What do you say to the teacher when you walk in? For an infant, how long can the infant concentrate on a sound without falling asleep? That was something my mother did to me when I was 14 days old and wrote her master's degree thesis about it. Her PhD thesis had to do with my speech development. So I can say I was the most important data in my mother's PhD. But you can see that Binet is changing the goalposts as the child is growing. That really the things are completely are completely incompatible. They're a mix. So for example, this is a test question from the Binet-Simon scale. The child is supposed to decide which of these women is the most attractive. I suppose that Binet, who was not too attractive, that was a question that he considered very, very important. But for us, I think it's negligible. It's not important. So Vygotsky doesn't assume that the units of development are aliquot. He doesn't assume that you can divide them evenly. He doesn't assume they're fungible, that a unit is a unit is a unit. On the contrary, he says the opposite. He says that a month in the life of the infant is not interchangeable with a month in the life of an adolescent. That means there'll be moments when development seems to be proceeding steadily, and there are other moments when development seems to come to a stop or even go backwards. Those moments he called stable periods and crises. In other words, measuring out development by comparing development to development, comparing critical development with stable development. That's where he's going to get his units. That's where he's going to get his measurements. That's where he's going to build his pedology. Now, I shouldn't say that this is entirely Vygotsky's idea. It's in the air. A lot of people are doing this. Boozman, for example, does it. And also Vygotsky takes his stable ages and his crises from not just the scientific literature, which he reads all of and digests very critically. He even takes it from folk concepts. So if you look at his description of 3-year-old negativism, as he calls it, it's the crisis at 3, the crisis of no, don't wanna, I don't wanna do it. There are a lot of folk concepts here. He describes it as the 7 stars, which I think are the Pleiades and not the Big Dipper, but it's the 7 stars of 3-year-old negativism. However, there are 4 things, according to Vygotsky, and I believe him, that are completely different about Vygotsky's periodization. Number 1, crises are periods. They're not just negative phases. They're periods in their own right. They have their own critical social situation of development, which is the term Vygotsky uses to talk about the relationship between the child and the environment. They have their own critical lines of development, which are I guess the activity theorists would call them the leading activity, but that's not a term that Vygotsky uses ever. And finally, there are critical neoformations, which is sort of the outcome of the line of development. That's the first thing. So crises are periods in their own right. And what he draws from this, by the way, is very important. He says the crisis is positive and not just negative. The crisis has something to contribute. It's not something to be done away with, to be attenuated, to be jumped over, skipped over, or even avoided. It is something that teachers, parents, and above all children take head on, and they get something positive from it. It's part of development itself. Second thing that's different, the second thing that divides Vygotsky's periodization from all other periodizations. Embryonal development is not development. It's merely growth. The embryo is not learning. The embryo is just growing. And birth, on the other hand, is development. Birth is development. It's a whole period. It's not just the moment of parturition, the moment when the baby finally becomes physiologically separate from the mother. It's the whole period where parturition is simply the peak. Third thing, Vygotsky excludes the whole of young adulthood. And he actually says, this is a slight contradiction. If you read it carefully, you'll see it. He says that the period of interest for us ends roughly at 17 or 18, with the crisis at 17 or 18. And that means, Hannah was talking a little bit about sociocultural theory and applied linguistics. Hannah, if you're out there, you'll notice that both Swain and Landolf and Painter and both the people at the University of Ontario in Toronto and the people at Pennsylvania State University like to study their own students. University students, they're great. You just ask them for permission and then you can do all kinds of tests on them. The problem is they're not developing. And so if you want to talk about the zone of proximal development, you do not want to talk about university students. And this is something that applied linguistics has yet to come to terms with. So no ZPD for your university students. Go out and get yourself some real children if you want to study development. Pedology is not the science of growth. It's not about embryos. And it's not really the science of adult education. It is the science of that class of human beings who are able to grow and learn at exactly the same time, and how that growth and that interaction, how that growth and that learning interact with each other. So no ZPD for university students. Get yourself some real children and do some real ZPD research. And then finally, the last one, and this is the most surprising for a lot of people. Sexual maturation, puberty, is a stable age. It's not a crisis. All of us think of that terrible moment of coming of age as being the biggest crisis in our whole life. The moment when you realize that for the rest of your life, you're going to be pursuing people who are a different shape from you, and sometimes even a different gender. All of this is a terrible crisis. But for Vygotsky, no, it can't be. Why? Because the neoformation you get out of it will last you your whole life long. Ergo, by definition, it is a stable neoformation and not a critical one, because critical neoformations are always subsumed, dialectically sublated into stable neoformations. Now, this is a work in progress. Vygotsky numbers his crises. He says crisis at 1, crisis at 3, crisis at 7, crisis at 13, and there's even a crisis at 17 that he never talks about, unfortunately. We'll try to learn something about the crisis at 17 when we do Pedology of the Adolescent, but Pedology of the Adolescent is written at a time before he's written this book, and he doesn't yet have that very clear differentiation between crises and stable periods. So the crises are given numbers: 1, 3, 7, 13, 17. Be careful. Those are not birthdays. Those are not even calendar years or astronomical years or passport years. They don't represent the number of times the Earth went around the sun. They represent developmental years. But if they represent developmental years, then doesn't that just mean the crisis at 1 starts whenever the crisis at 1 starts? The crisis at 3 starts whenever the crisis at 3 starts. The crisis at 7 starts, you know, when the child starts making faces in the samovar and giving a funny walk and talking like a duck, even though you punish the child. What good is that? That doesn't help us. Well, it does bring us to the next question. And I'm going to pose these as questions. Actually, first of all, I'm going to ask Nikolai if he has anything to say at this point. And if anybody has protests, comments, sort of, can you go over that a bit? Please put them in the chat and we'll come up with something. Yeah. We'll come up with a working hypothesis before we go on. Nikolai? Yeah,
of course, I have a lot of things to say, but given that this is a summer school, so I prefer the audience to come with the questions, if you don't mind, David.
Okay. All right. Well, I have something to say. But if audience takes the stage, it might be much better. Okay. People. I'm looking in the chat box. I don't see anything. So Nikolai, you want to tread water until we get something in the chat box, or should I just go on?
Please go on, David.
Okay, all right. I should point out, though, that Nikolai, for all his modesty, leaves out a crucial detail in our work on this book together. We always speak in English. We never speak in Russian. And there's a very simple reason. I can't speak in Russian at all. I didn't start learning Russian until I was well into my 50s. And that is, Vygotsky tells us, way too late for language acquisition. He's not a biological language acquisitionist. He doesn't believe that there is a critical period in the sense of Lenneberg or Chomsky or anything like that. But he does believe there are optimal periods for learning things. And he would look at me and say, you know, Dr. Kellogg, you are way past the point where you should be learning Russian. so Nikolai is absolutely crucial to that, crucial to our understanding of these texts. Now, you're probably looking at this beautiful painting and thinking, what is this painting doing there? It's a 17th century Dutch painting by Jacob Jordaens, who was a Catholic. And it's Luke, Matthew, Mark, and John. I think John is the youngest one, but that's all I know. I can't, normally they give you little animals so that you can recognize which one is which. Well, these are the synoptic gospels. They're written in Greek, and the Russians are a lot closer to Greek than we are. The Roman Empire was interested in Latin. The Byzantine Empire did Greek, and the Russians got their texts from the Byzantine Empire. So these are the Greek Gospels, and they're called the Synoptic Gospels because they tell the same story, but in different orders. One might call them disorders. The order is slightly different, but you've got 4 different views of the life of Christ. In other words, the life of Christ is treated as a story that exists independently of time. And that brings me to my second question. How does Vygotsky see these age periods as wholes without destroying the key element of time? Now, you might think, well, that's kind of an abstract question. It's not very interesting, but it's very interesting in the following way. To what extent are these periods predetermined and predeterminable? To what extent are they fate? To what extent are they imminent? That is an interesting problem for pedology. Now, Vygotsky tells us that on the one hand, the age periods are time processes, they unfold in time. On the other hand, they tell the same story. What is that story? Well, to put it briefly, there's an upswing and a downswing and a peak. Yeah, but that's not very interesting. That's sort of structuralist. It's interesting because the upswing and the downswing, as Nikolai was describing, can be caused by the environment as well as caused imminently. So that's interesting right there. We got something interesting from Suxiang. In fact, I'm going to stop right here and bring in Suxiang's question and then go back to Catherine's question, because I think it's related to what I'm saying. So Suxiang says, why is there no ZPD for university students? I still find this hard to understand.
There is.
Maybe it's because, no, there isn't. Maybe it's because I am confusing myself about the concept of learning and development again. Good, very good. Can you explain this a little bit more? Yes, I can. What is the relationship between the ZPD and the crisis that you are talking about right here? Okay, the social situation of development is a relationship between the child and the environment. And as Nikolai said, there are some crises, certainly some crises, that are caused purely by the environment. You know, the child doesn't cause the parents to get divorced. The child doesn't cause the parents to emigrate to another country where the mother tongue is not spoken. These are entirely environmental influences. And so these are crises that are not imminent in child development. There are other crises that are imminent. And by imminent, I mean unavoidable. You cannot minimize them. You cannot get around them. You can't jump over them. You can't dig under them. You got to go through them. Why? Well, because they're inherent in the process of development itself. The child, for example, is physically growing. And at some point, the body is ready for reproduction. The endocrine glands say so, the sweat glands say so, you can smell it, you can see it. And that is unavoidable. It's the interaction between the physical growth of the child and the mental growth of the child. The fact that they don't take place at exactly the same time, the way that Minot and Gazelle were thinking that, yeah, they have to take place just in lockstep. They don't take place in lockstep. It's much more like the Pacific plate bumping up against the Australian plate and causing a massive earthquake or a volcano eruption in Tonga. These are crises, and they're caused by the non-coincidence of one form of development and another. That's why pedagoggical crises have to do with growing beings, not just developing ones, but people who are physically growing. Physically growing. The child's voice sounds different from the school child's voice. The school child's voice sounds different from the adolescent's voice. And that is because of physical differences. Now, there's something else going on. Because the child is grasping speech, a whole number of psychological transformations are taking place. And I'm going to suggest, Su-Xiang, that nothing that happens in university is quite as important as what happens when the child is between 1 and 3. So Nikolai is interested in early years. Jos is interested in early years. We got Su-Xiang is interested in early years. We got a lot of people here interested in early years, and there's a good reason for that. It's because nothing that happens in university is development in the same way that the development of language between 1 and 3 is development. It's just not the same. So I'm going to suggest that the zone of proximal development is a way of diagnosing the distance to the next developmental milestone. And for university students, there isn't one. There isn't a developmental milestone in exactly the same sense as there has been in childhood, because the developmental milestones in childhood have to do with mental, but also physical development. And that element is missing at university. So no ZPD for university students. Vygotsky doesn't talk about ZPD for university students, and the pedology doesn't talk about the ZPD for university students. Nikolai is going to disagree here, right, Nikolai?
Of course, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I agree. But well, please, dear people, please don't panic. We have a lot of disagreements with David, but we are close friends and we cooperate. Don't take it as a kind of traumatic situation. Well, yes, there is a ZPD for children, and this is related to the organic growth as well. But my point is that there is a ZPD for university students, but this ZPD is quite different. The ZPD is, okay, I put it this way. Are there any ZPD of intellectual development for university teachers? Can teachers develop their intellectual capacities during their university teaching practice?
I would say it's a zone of proximal learning and not a zone of proximal.
No, not development. No, I mean a development of intellectual abilities, not a learning, but intellectual abilities. For example, is there any opportunity for university teachers to change their thinking about something? For example, to make a transition from formal thinking to dialectical thinking through learning dialectics? Yes, of course, yes. You can start learning dialectics. You can start study dialectics to change your thinking, to raise your thinking to a high level from formal logic thinking to dialectical thinking at any age. I mean, if you are a university teacher. The same about university students, by the way. Of course, it's a different ZPD comparing to children, but it's still a ZPD. So I think a good university teacher is a teacher who creates a ZPD for university students, because unless it is not created, it does not exist.
Thanks, Nikolai. Let me bring in Catherine's comment here. Catherine says in EFL, because Catherine's comment is really important. One thing that university students do, which does change a lot in the way that they learn, is to learn foreign languages. This is true. And to a certain extent, I would make an exception to my statement that there are no ZPDs for university students around the following lines. That when you start, see, one of the strange things that's happened in linguistics, and Hannah knows this perfectly well, so does CHAR, so do all of you who are learning language, is that if you take a normal person in their mother tongue, you see a lot of doubling of vocabulary in very young children. And even parents with notebooks take account of this, just as they like to do snapshots of their child every month and then do a montage. They talk about the size of the child's vocabulary. The child gets to be about 17 and something very strange happens. The vocabulary stops growing. 17, 18-year-olds, it depends. It depends on whether you go to university or not. It's one of the things it depends on. But if you leave school and you start a factory job, you'll find that the vocabulary doesn't grow. It certainly doesn't grow at the same pace it did before. And in some ways, the vocabulary actually starts to deteriorate and to diminish. And you can really see this if you try to think of all your high school lessons in algebra and in calculus. You'll see that there are bits of your vocabulary already missing. That seems not to happen with second language learners. Second language learners are actually undergoing something like a language boom, a second language boom, a second youth. And we still don't quite understand the implications of this. So for example, there's some evidence that people who do learn a second language, including people who learn a second language in university, are much less susceptible to dementia. That's hard to understand why that should be, but it does seem to be the case. Now, Catherine remarks that in EFL, lots of teachers try to use Vygotsky and ZPD to account for how students might acquire language. I'm going to suggest that what they're really using is something called scaffolding. They're using a way of, as Vygotsky says, leading questions, doing demonstrations, starting solutions and not finishing them, which Vygotsky saw as being ways of diagnosing the distance to the next developmental milestone. They're using them to teach. In other words, it's as if diagnosis and treatment were the same thing. That's not true. If it were true, if you could scaffold, for example, a grammatical system, let's say the present continuous for a child, and you say, look, I talk, I am talking, or I swim, I am swimming. And then suddenly the child immediately knows what the present continuous does and can use it fluently. Okay, let's imagine that there's a situation where you can say that. All you have done is to prove that the present continuous was not part of the zone of proximal development. It was part of the zone of actual development. How do we know? Because the child actually developed it. The zone of proximal development is the distance to the next developmental milestone, which we can diagnose, which we can estimate, which we can guesstimate by looking at how the child is able to pick up, to intelligently imitate things that the child does not really yet master. And this is why I would say, yes, you're right, Catherine, in EFL, lots of teachers use Vygotsky and ZPD to account for how students might acquire language. But I would say lots of teachers misuse it and confuse diagnosis with treatment. The second thing that Catherine raises is Maslow. Now, everybody should know that Catherine is not talking about M.M. Maslow, who is a Russian pedagogist, actually. She's talking about Abraham Maslow, who set up a kind of on the basis of some great Gestalt psychologists, including Gelb and Goldmark, and the Gestaltists who took refuge from Hitler. He set up this kind of triangle at the basis of which was survival needs, and then there were sort of biological needs, and then there were needs for safety and security, and then there were needs for love, and then needs for, I think the top one was self-actualization, respect, and then there was self-actualization, and that this is sort of a pyramid of Maslow's needs. Vygotsky does talk about a hierarchy of needs, but he talks about it a very different one. The first one is biological, it's instincts. The second one is, which he equates for a while with what he calls unconditioned or unconditional reflexes or responses. It's a little bit of Pavlov there, a little bit of Russian reflexology. And then the next stage is the conditioned ones, the enculturated ones, which we can call learning. Above that stage, Bühler and also Vygotsky at one point puts intelligent solutions to novel problems, which we can call intelligence or creativity or what have you. And then this is all in the text that Nikolai is going to be teaching soon, the development of the higher mental functions. And then the highest one is free will, the ability to make your own decisions. That is kind of a different hierarchy of needs. And I think if Catherine wants to apply the ZPD to adults, that would be the place to look. I don't know if I would call it ZPD. And you know, since Jos invited PhD students to say, in this thesis, I am going to define my topic thus. And I think that's a good move that every PhD student has to do. I'm going to say that in the pedology, Vygotsky chooses to define development thus. Development is the period, is the kinds of crises and ages that we see in the pedology. Okay, then we've got one last one. Oh, no, we've got a whole bunch of them. Oh, what fun. Great. Okay, Zixi says, Liang Zixi says, I assume the ZPD is not only to be used for cognitive development, but can also be used for emotional development. I don't assume that, Zixi, because to me, emotion is always there. It's right there from the very beginning. And I would say that what Nikolai has been saying about post childhood development is certainly true of social emotional development. And so I think Nikolai and I probably disagree on there too. Nikolai?
Yeah, well, I'm very skeptical about the term social emotional development because I find this terminology senseless, because cognitive development for Vygotsky is a social development. There is no other way, there is no other development or development, because the social environment is the source of development. So development is a cultural social process, okay? Cognitive development is a social development. Emotional development is a social development, okay? Development of fantasy, imagination is a social development. So, and social emotional is a terminology which comes outside, from outside. It's not a Vygotsky's understanding. That's why the question about ZPD for cognitive and also for social and emotional doesn't make any sense. You know, you are mixing two different terminologies here. So they are in conflict, they are in contradiction. And even more, why social emotional? Why not social cognitive? Why not social imagination? Why social emotional? Why they are combining the social and emotional? I still don't understand. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but this is my opinion.
Well, this brings us to Tara's question. Okay, so Tara asks if the ZPD is limited to something that is cognitive and that is also emotional, namely language. And Tara seems to think that I am suggesting that the ZPD is limited to language learning. And I wasn't suggesting that at all. I don't think that sexuality, for example, is purely linguistic. I think that sexuality develops largely independent of language. In fact, I would say that the love that dares not speak its name, whether you are gay or straight, has to develop pretty much without language, at least. So I don't want to say that that the ZPD is
but it's language. But however, this is a very good question about well, developing language, and Nikolai has brought it into the other learning. Well, the point is that it's not Nikolai who takes this in a broader sense. It was Vygotsky. He said that, yeah, for intellectual development, we definitely can measure ZPD for intellectual development through the tasks that child can solve independently or can solve with the help of the teacher and under the guidance and so on. But Vygotsky also says that there are also zones of proximal development for emotions, for memory, and even for perception. But we have to make a research on that. What are the instruments we can use to measure the zone of proximal development for development of memory or emotions? So, and he wrote about that. He didn't extend this, he didn't explain that, but he said that, yeah, there are zones of proximal development, not only for thinking, not only for intellect, but also for memory and perception and even imagination. So unfortunately, nobody takes it. And after 100 years after Vygotsky death, nobody did any research about zone of proximal development and in relation to memory or volition or perception, unfortunately. Okay.
Yeah, incredibly, he even talks about zones of proximal development in terms of physical education.
Yes, yeah,
In
absolutely.
theory,
Yeah.
in theory, physical education obeys the same basic zones.
Yeah.
And this to me suggests that development, at least as it's used in pedology, is closely linked to, it is a treatise of the body and not simply of the mind. And this sort of gets back to Catherine's question. I, unlike Nikolai, would resist the idea of sociocultural, of reducing development to the sociocultural development of cognition. I think that emotion is much more embodied than cognition.
And volition, and will also.
Right, but see, for me, the key test of will is, at least in adolescent development, is recognizing consent, and in particularly sexual consent. Sexual consent is to me, I don't like the Cartesian idea that the ultimate test of will is, can you accept Jesus Christ and be saved? I think there's a much bigger test in the lives of most adolescents, which is, can you find a partner who is willing to be your partner? And this is a big problem in adolescent development. And it's not just cognition, it's also deeply, deeply emotional for our kids. Right, Hannah raises the question, can there be a ZPD for second language development? And what are the challenges in determining these? I don't know. This is clearly related to the problem I'm having with Russian, which is a sort of a mirror of the problem I had with Korean and even to some extent with Chinese, although I sort of feel like I learned Chinese in my 20s and I sort of feel like, we still speak it at home. I feel like the further I get away from my childhood, the more cognitive rather than emotional my language learning becomes. And I think that does to me suggest that emotion has a very special role to play, at least in my case, but I don't really know. And Hannah, this one's for you. This is why we need applied linguists, desperately need applied linguists to correct what I think is a far too behavioral interpretation of Vygotsky. We are still looking, even the name activity theory suggests that we are still not taking on board Vygotsky's emphasis on language and speech as being in some way central to child development. I should say in response to Samran's point that, first of all, he's right. Human speech does develop in adulthood, but it develops in a different way. Secondly, I think Vygotsky, just to make the more general point, Vygotsky never reduces development to the development of speech. What he says is, yes, the child learns to talk, but the child also learns to walk. And you have to pay attention to the secondary actors as well as the primary actors. But what he does do is speech is his go-to example. Language is the constant example he has of the combination of mental development and physical development. He's constantly going to this as an example. And so speech does have a very special place in development for Vygotsky. And it's clearly not just about the rhythm of development, it's also about that the means of development itself is developing. Okay, that's the sense in which it's acceleration and not simply velocity. And the easiest way to see how the means of development itself can develop is to study human speech. That we have not been doing. We have been treating development the way that Köhler treated mediated action, which is take a stick and get a banana. And the use of language is something very, very different. Vygotsky knew that, and we need to keep that in mind when we use words like ZPT. Okay, yeah, right, Catherine, something happens, a gear change, something happens, takes place. What does happen? And how could we find out about it? How could we study it? Well, I'm giving you the following depressing painting. Hongzhi, you have to tell me when we cut for discussion, because I'm sure this is, I'm going to go over my speaking limit otherwise.
I think now is the time. Yeah, as we planned it, but yeah.
So do I have time now, or can I talk about this depressing painting or not?
Yeah, of course you can.
Okay,
Yeah,
this is again a 17th century painting, and she looks like she's asleep. She's dead. This was a fairly common practice. People could not get their portraits of their children painted because the children were just being too active, and having your portrait painted involved sitting for a very long time. So very often you didn't get your portrait painted until you were dead. And secondly, a lot of people, that's the only memory of their child that they have. So because people died a lot in the 17th century, they died a lot in childbirth, and they died a lot immediately after childbirth. Vygotsky says at one point that there's no point at which the child is closer to death than immediately after birth. That's not true anymore, but it was true for Vygotsky. It was very true in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Child mortality was extremely high. And in fact, it's been estimated that the life expectancy of a just born child was something like the life expectancy of an 85-year-old man. Because so much tuberculosis, because so much hardship, so much starvation. You still see things like this today. You see, for example, that when the child goes away to college, the mother very often keeps the child's room exactly as it was when the child went away to college, as a way of remembering what childhood was. But the fact that child mortality is so high, the fact that pathological processes are so frequent in childhood, brings Vygotsky to an interesting problem. And he's probably carried there by his own disease, by the way. Remember, he's looked after his little brother who died and became very ill himself and eventually died. So is there, after taking away dentition and sexual maturation, maybe there is an analogy to be made between illness, disorder, and development? Is there? Yes. And in fact, the order of development and the disorder of development, and I'm going to argue that a lot of what we call mental illness is better conceived of as mental disorder, a kind of a disordering of the developmental phases that normal people go through. And in particular, the prolongation of crises is one of the symptoms of mental disorder, which we will not call mental illness, but we'll call disorder. So there are analogies we can use to study, and Vygotsky uses a lot of these. The crisis at 1 can be studied by studying aphasia. The crisis at 3 looks a lot like what was called hysteria. We don't call it that anymore, but we call it manic depressive disorder or cyclothymia or something. The crisis at 7 is a little bit on the autism spectrum. And the crisis at 13 is schizothymic, i.e. schizophrenic. Every analogy has limits, and here are 3. Number 1, the developmental crisis, unlike the pathological one, is restricted to children. Why? Same reason the ZPD is restricted to children. 2, developmental crises end in greater vitality. They don't end in debility. They don't end in death. 3, developmental crises are age specific. If we take a very large population we find that on the average, the crisis at 1 occurs around the first birthday, 3 around the third birthday, 7 around the 7th birthday, and so on. And this is why the crises Nikolai was just talking about of divorce, of moving to another country where they speak a different language, they can't be considered imminent to development, and they can't be considered pedagoggical crises in exactly the same way. And I would argue that the learning of the adult is of the same order. It's interesting, but it's not the object of study in the pedology. So the fact of temporal limitation does set the ontogenetic crisis apart, the developmental crisis apart from the pathogenetic one. Okay, I probably don't have the time to go through the periods one by one. So what I'm going to do is cut to this curious talisman. A lot of, I think Eshraq will immediately recognize this, or think she recognizes it, as the hand of Fatima. But it isn't actually, because Eshraq, if you look at it, you'll notice the writing is not Arabic. It's Hebrew. A lot of cultures, including the Hindu, the Islamic, and the Hebraic culture that Vygotsky himself belonged to, have talismans like this that consist of a hand. And this hand, I'm going to suggest, is an interesting way of talking about the 5 stable periods, count them, and the 6 gaps between the stable periods, like the space between your fingers and the space between your 2 hands. So birth at the beginning and adulthood at the end. And that we can set up the 5 stable periods in this Hamza. Hamza means, well, Eshraq knows what it means. It means 5. And that stands for the 5 stable periods, the 5 stable neoformations, 5 central lines of development, and the 6 crises that punctuate them, that cut them off. And immediately you'll see, all I've done is to take, well, actually I've taken mostly conversation, but you'll see immediately that Vygotsky is not just talking about the development of language, that Vygotsky is talking about things like play. Vygotsky is talking about things like sexuality, like work, like labor, and roughly in the culminating moment, free choice, free will. And I don't mean just what do you want to be when you grow up, but also what are the realistic choices for children of partner, of persona, which is related to personality, sort of the way that, I don't know, creativity is related to imagination, or activity is related to thinking, and professions, realistic job choices. These are the 5 stable periods and the 6 crises, as I have abstracted them from the pedagogical works, along with some of the work I've done using Halliday. How are we doing for time, Hongzhi? Should we?
Yeah, we have 20 minutes. Maybe we can have 10 minutes discussion in the group and come back. 10 minutes for sharing.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. I've got some tasks for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. Hongzhi is going to do this. And the first thing you have to do is to find the person with the youngest passport age. That is to say, the youngest calendar age, not developmental age. That will take too long. And that person is going to be your non-voluntary spokesman. They're going to be responsible for reporting back. And then you have to choose one of these 5 questions, which Hongzhi will communicate to you, and then come up with some working hypothesis for an answer that you can report back. And the 5 questions are sort of what we've covered here, but not quite. Okay?
Yeah.
Hongzhi, we ready?
Yeah, I posted them here. Then maybe we break into like 5 rooms.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, or I think 4 rooms maybe.
Are you going to put Nikolai and me into groups, or do we get to fly around from group to group?
Yeah, it's up to you. If you do you want to be within a group or?
Oh, put me in a group.
David, are you? are you okay to be in the group, or we can just jump from group to group?
I'm not sure. Is that technically possible, Hongzhi?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's move from group to group then.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I will move you to the, sorry. Take you long. Oh. Just 1 second, sorry. Okay.
So who is youngest? Find the youngest person, the person who is closest to childhood, and then decide on a question. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nikolai is very interested in number 5, and come up with some working hypothesis for an answer.
Yeah, just 1 second. Thinking. Yeah, I will leave you and Nikolai in the main room. So yes. Sorry. Yes, now all the room is open.
Great. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Great. Okay.
So David, can you view the rooms and enter, or maybe we need to assign you as a co-host?
Yeah. We need to be a co-host. Then we can jump.
Yeah. Maybe John, can you help?
I'm back to Melbourne, yes. Hi, John.
Hi, John.
Mhm. John is now the host. You are the host now. Veronica, you can give us the host.
Yeah. Oh, I can't. Unfortunately, I cannot really. It has to be assigned by John.
Okay,
Yeah.
John. John, if you can open the participants button, and you will see yourself as host and all of us.
I can see it, and I can join.
Okay, yeah.
I'm off to room 1.
Okay.
I'm going
You
to
go
room
to
1.
room. Okay. I go to room 2.
Okay. I'll join room 3. Yeah, we are all co-host. Let me see. Francis is still outside. Yeah, Francis is still outside, Queen. Maybe. Anyway.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Just right. I'll go off and see. Join one of the rooms.
Me too. I'll
Actually, we'll
join
just.
room 3.
Presumably Frances isn't there, so that's why she's not joined.
I'll go to room 3.
Which means it's actually not a truth. Hi, John. We are talking about number 4, and Zizi is going to be our presenter for our room. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually think, yeah, you're right. And also, I think for child development, there's literally no fine line to determine, okay, if this child is 4 years old, for example, and that's what he's supposed to do, like it shouldn't be like from the Piaget's perspective, but rather than that, it should be more unique, because every child development is very unique, and maybe by a certain age, some children can do more, some children can do less. But yeah, so when we ask a child, how old are you? It shouldn't just as simple as a number, but yeah, it's more about what the child experience and what type of social relationship the child have. Or the social environment side as well.
And Sharon and Tara, what do you think?
I think there's a kind of an implicit assessment that we are doing all the time. And we expect, when you see a child, we just expect something from the child. And based on the child's reaction, we just want to kind of see how old the child is, in the sense of whether, you know, the child's more precocious, or, you know, the way we imagine, you know, like able to do things the way we imagine it to do at a certain period. I mean, although it's not explicit, there is some kind of an assessment going on in our own mind as to whether the child's like about the age period. I mean, you know, like the development about the age or below the age, or age-wise, or whatever. I think that's the kind of socio-cultural kind of norms that we have implicitly kind of there in our mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think also coming in as an educator, that you asking how old a child is, that you would also have in your set of knowledge, you know, the sorts of experience, knowledge of the experiences they might have had coming in, the environmental, you know, as far as schooling, as far as kindergarten or early childhood. But yeah, well, I really wouldn't ask a child how old they are. Because, you know, that the way they are organised in schools, they're already organised according to their age, you know, their biological age as such. You know, there's no way of, you know, we don't account for, you know, development as such. It's all categorized. Their children are categorized by their biological age, you know, and even when they go through early childhood, they're put into rooms according to their biological age. So, you know, there's really no need to ask a child how old they are. I don't think there is, because we already know.
Do it all the time. But we do it all the time.
Do we?
No, we do it all the time. We keep asking children, how old are you? Which class, at least which class are you in? Which grade? Yes, I mean, more or less, we know then that that's an indirect way of finding out how old they are.
Yeah,
I mean,
and I also, sorry.
Is it just a kind of shorthand, a way of sort of categorizing an individual into a kind of a set of understandings that we have of development at various levels? I mean, it would be all very good to actually treat every child as an individual and really assess, you know, where they are in a whole range of developmental things, but we just don't have the time to do that when we come across a child for the first time and we say, you know, are you in grade 2 or grade 7? There's a whole set of expectations about what we can, then the way that we can interact with them, which are really just shorthands. And you will find children in grade 7 who act like children in grade 3, and you will then start to treat them like that and start to do the things that would be appropriate for them at that level. But as a kind of a starting point, it's like David said, with the average, you know, the crisis at 1357 are crises that occur on average for children at that age. So if you look at, you know, children who are undergoing that movement from to an independent will, and you see that, you know, occurring roughly at age 3, and therefore you start to make, but clearly, yes, there'll be some children who are doing it at a chronological age of 4 or 2 or, so on. So is it just a shorthand, or is there something deeper here? Is it just a way of just coping with the sheer diversity of people in the world that we have to?
Yes, true. But I think sometimes the adults or educators have this kind of perceptions, for example, by a certain age, like for example, like 2 years old, and if the child still could not be able to speak, and then they will think, okay, this child is problematic. But I think some of the time is probably some children just need more time to develop, but we shouldn't probably put them into the box saying, okay, if by a certain age you couldn't be able to do this, then you have a problem.
Then on the other hand, that also could be accounted for the fact of what their social situation of development has been, as far as that negative view of children. If they're not meeting milestones, it might be because of the environment in which they're situated, the context in which they are in, as far as the possibilities and experiences they have had. It's a bit like EAL, or children learning English as a second language. Quite often the experience I've had in education is that it's a negative connotation, that they're behind, when in actual fact they're not behind. They're learning a second language, which means that they have a different trajectory in their development in comparison to English speakers. Yet educators view them that they're behind, when in actual fact they're not.
Totally.
Good point.
So, and I think also that in that categorization of children, as far as according to their biological age, or whether it be in their grade levels or whatever, what we miss out on is education is the fact of we don't take account of what their social, cultural, their home environment, their family environment, and so the fact is that we really don't account for that, and we don't find out about that, enough about that. And so we miss so much about the children in working with them as a result of that. We make lots of assumptions about children in these stages and these age periods.
Myself, should we, when we're dealing with children, do blind auditions, so we shouldn't actually know anything about them before we start to make judgments of their abilities or whatever? Is that possible, advisable? How should, it's all very well to say that every child is different and we should take them as they come. How could we practically do that? A classroom of 20 children, who each of them you get to deal with for about 3 or 4 minutes a day, realistically.
Oh, they love, I don't know, as far as you're talking about assessment of children or finding out about children, I think primary schools do it better than what secondary schools do it, as far as finding out about children. I would say, as far as the starting points in their learning, that is. It's quite different in secondary, so I can't really talk, but it is different in secondary. And it's the way in which school systems set up, and the way in which leadership value the individual, because the fact is there's been a huge push for personalized learning. So therefore, if you're pushing for a personalized learning, in schools, therefore you've got to provide time for teachers to get to know their kids.
And I think when you are talking about this individualized learning, and John, I think you are right. It's very difficult when there are a lot of children or students in one classroom. But I think, I'm not so sure, probably it's only because I'm in the early years. So we do spend like whole day with young children. So we do have that kind of like primitive assumptions of each child, but we do make sure that we are coming back to check, is this kind of judgment really true about this child? And I think last year in the summer school, we talked about the moral imagination. So we always remind ourselves to be like, see a greater person in the particular child. So I guess we do have the need to jump into the quick like assumptions, because that's an effective way to do it. But we also need to come back and check whether we have any prejudices. I'm not so sure whether I'm understanding your points correctly.
Yeah. No, but I thought what John was talking about, like I say, in a class of 20, I think much depends on how much opportunity we create for children to really kind of respond to something, some kind of a prompt or a provocation or something where we have a chance to understand, listen to and understand students. I think that's where we can, start non-judgmentally, as far as possible, and understand each student from what they say, what they express about themselves. I think that's one way of possible way of doing it.
Yes.
But I suppose also coming back to what you were talking about, John, the time factor as far as with 20 individuals or 30 individuals in a classroom setting. And then when you've got to teach across the curriculum and the time aspect that you have of finding out about where children are at within those, which is different, I suppose, but that's to do with the learning, not so. Yeah, so therefore you always press with the time factor in getting to know children. And one of the things is that the blind assumption, having the coming in blind, can actual fact, getting to know children can take time. So therefore you can miss things. And so what you also want is that communication across time, so that children that require additional support or additional tuition or within the classrooms are not left for another 6 months before we find out where they're at.
I mean, clearly there's 6 months for a 2-year-old is a bigger percentage time difference than 6 months for an 18-year-old. So in a sense, the kind of variation that we're getting will, by of necessity, to be greater for younger children than for older, which makes sense that in early childhood we spend a lot of time with individual trying, because those 3-year-olds will actually vary hugely, whereas the 18-year-olds, in a sense, will not. Well, they will actually. But so there's that kind of biological thing, but also perhaps is the fact that we seem to pay more attention to individual difference for the younger we get. Really a proxy for the fact that in fact we become less important as teachers. The adult relationship to a child is less important the older they get. They become more. It's the relationships to the peers, to other things going on in society. So is there a reason for the fact that this kind of individual differentiation is easier to do, but also seems to be more important the younger you get? That's not a kind of the tablets from on high. It's a question.
I don't know. I mean, research has shown that, certainly certainly shows that there's huge gaps between in year 7 around the 13-year-old mark as far as where children are in their learning. And so I'm not sure about that.
I suppose on that basis, the social situation development has had longer to have an effect. So a child who's been deprived of stimulation will really be so much further behind by 18 than they will be at 3. Whereas, so you have the opposite effect. Yes, you're quite right.
Yeah.
Zillian, maybe you can kind of get that as a question that from our group, what Sharon and John have suggested. That can become the problem that we want to pose from our group. Yeah.
Thank you for the discussion.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah. And thanks in advance, Zillian, for presenting our group question.
Didn't hear the end of it.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for closing the breakout rooms. I know you were having good discussion, but because of the limit of the time, we will have, now is the reporting time. Maybe we invite each group to give us a short report or briefing of your discussion in about 3 to 5 minutes from each group. So group 1, anyone from group 1, Catherine, Daden, David, Ezra, Francis.
Dan is the youngest.
No, not me. It's from Catherine. Please.
Right. It's the youngest. Passport age, not developmental age.
Right, gosh. We chose the question about if you ask a child what their age is, what is your motivation, or what is the way that you and when they give you the answer, how do you process that answer? Would that be more or less what we said?
Well, what the question said was, what do we mean when we ask how old are you?
Yeah.
And that's one interpretation of it. And then the question is there a scientific answer or not? Ishak, are you really older than Dadan?
No.
That's what I thought. Ishak, you're the baby. Come on.
Yeah, we have chosen number 4, and Catherine give us like kind of Japanese perspective, and David give us from Chinese or Korean, I believe, and Dan from Indonesia. But to summarize everything, that we in Japanese culture, that they going to ask about the age to identify if how much they're going to be respectful, and they call him by the name sensei or something like that. And also this is applicable for Korean. And from Dan and me as well, like the idea of respect. And if we want to put the Islamic lens here, for me, I said to determine exactly how we're going to talk in appropriate way with those kids, or not, like what's the what do we call it? The graduation, the gradation of the politeness, and the to how much we gonna be respectful and using appropriate language and discuss appropriate concept with them. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Now let's invite group 2, Hannah, Jenan, Judy, Julia, and Nikolai. Anyone from your group want to report to us?
Well, I was the youngest, so
Hannah, please.
I got this task. I think it was before you came in. So I'll do my best. As I said, team support me then. But we chose the number 5, and the question that we found interesting and that we discussed came from the field of defectology, and we discussed the spectrum of autism and how it can be considered in special education or pedagogy. I think that was roughly the question, and we talked that in our experience, social interaction side is often difficult for these children, or constrained, and therefore we have to find these, or it's important to find these roundabout ways of development, how to support the development, even though the social interaction and access to this cultural line of development is different for these children. Not delayed, but just different, as they don't have the usual typical cultural tools that are designed for normal children to access this line of development. And Right. So we talked about that the children in autism spectrum usually still are quite apt at written language. So this might be and can be one of the roundabout ways or ways of compensating and enabling them to access this cultural line of development despite their difficulties in social interaction. And that this should be or could be one of the important ways to support them in special education. And yeah, I think that was roughly it. Anything to add?
No, I think you've done well, Hannah.
Yeah, absolutely well.
Okay, thank you. Now group 3. Sorry, I left early from my group. Yeah, Odin, Noshin, and Samran. Any one of you want to share with us? Anyone from our group?
Nushin, please.
Samran. Yeah, Samran, I saw you unmuted.
So we try to understand. Hello, everyone. Sorry. So we try to understand question number 2. And especially we had an issue with the word whole. So I think, and we think that this question goes back to certifying the children based on their biological ages. And if we look at the kids in this way, it goes back to more Piagetian school or theory, but what Vygotsky believes in the development of kids and children is not based on the biological ages or stages. It is based on their intellectual stages. For example, a kid from lower age can be equal to a kid from a more older age. So what can sort them in the best way would be the intellectual development of them and these ages. Also, I think Andy had an example of her experience about visiting a school based on this kind of idea. If you want Andy to share that, your experience from that school.
Thanks, Samran. And I'll just disclose I was the oldest in the room. So thank you, Samran, for starting us off. I think you were the youngest. So yeah, I was just sharing about a primary school that was designed in a vertical school design. So the students were taught from this according to their stage and not their age. And we were talking a little bit about how whether that was effective or not. And then we decided that perhaps it's effective for those who believe that will be effective for them and their children. And that also perhaps the teaching this way when it comes to those other sections of the question, how to provide for variation versus how to avoid teaching lockstep, that perhaps it's problematic depending on how you approach that as a teacher and what your ideologies are in those different contexts in which you teach as well. Nushin, did you want to add?
Thank you. Thank you for group 3. Now let's move to the last group. Yeah, Sharon, Suxiang, Tara, and Zixi. Anyone from your group want to speak?
Yeah, I'm the youngest one in my group. So we also choose the question 4. So when we're talking about and asking a child, like how old are they? We usually determine the child from their biological age. And we also make some assumptions about what the child could do in a certain age. But we also said sometimes in the early childhood center, they tend to do some assessment as well. But we think it shouldn't actually be done this way because every children have their unique or different trajectory. And there are some variations we have to really take into account. So that means we can take into account some individual differences and also their family environment at the same time. We couldn't just say, okay, this child couldn't be able to do these things at this age. That means they're undeveloped or they're late behind. But this is also kind of problematic sometimes because when we're just first met a child, and then if we only have very limited time and just ask a simple question for 3 to 4 minutes to get to know them, it's a bit hard to kind of know everything about the child. So we really think just for designing like the best curriculum for the child is definitely should take time, and there should be more communications and but we shouldn't make assumptions at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, group 3. Thank you, Zixin. And yeah, David, do you want to, or Nikolai, do you want to wrap up before we have a break?
No.
No? Yeah. Then
Just one quick comment. One of the things that Vygotsky emphasizes throughout the book is that pedology is the art of the relational indicator. It's the relational indicator, not the absolute indicator. You can see this in everyday life. Here in Korea, in order to talk to anybody, you have to find out their biological passport age because your grammar depends on it, whether you are going to use honorary verb endings or whether you're going to use plain verb endings depends on the biological passport age of the person you're talking to. That is a relational indicator, even though it's linked to the number of times that the Earth went around the sun. It's a relational indicator because the key problem is, are you older than me or are you younger than me? And what I'm putting forward to you is that not only do we need both absolute indicators and relational indicators, but we need to keep in mind that they are related to each other. Relational indicators can be related to absolute indicators, and not just statistically, not just because if we take very large populations, the crisis at 1 does happen around the first birthday, but also because it's part of life. We're constantly using relational indicators in our everyday life. And that anything that we do in everyday life, we can find the core, the kernel, the germ of a scientific concept. And that's what the pedology is really about. That's all I had to say. Thanks, everybody.
thank you, David.